Welcome to Norris McLaughlin's Aging Answers, a limited podcast series discussing the key topics of elder law planning and long-term care. I'm your host, Shana Siegel, practice group leader of the Elder Law Group and member at Norris McLaughlin. In this episode, I'm joined by elder care strategist Adrian Allotey to talk about solo senior planning. Hi, Adrian. How are you?
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Good.
Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. So, Adrian, this is your second time on our podcast.
Yeah.
So the first time we talked about your practice, you're an end-of-life doula.
Yes.
But you also work with solo seniors more generally. So do you want to tell us a little bit about how your practice works with solo seniors?
Sure. So as you probably know, that number is increasing. And one of the things that I find, which is really, I don't want to use the word disturbing, but which is a concern that we need to address on so many different levels, is the lack of companionship and some fears that go along with that. Do I have a set of eyes on me? Whether it's an emergency, we have a storm coming up, whether it is just making sure that I have food in my refrigerator. So that set of eyes on solo agers really is one of their biggest concerns. And I would say probably for myself too.
No, I understand. And I am finding that more and more of my clients are solo agers. And recently I was out on a walk with a bunch of older women, and we were talking about the future, and they were talking about how they were going to solve for this issue of being alone. And, could they do co-housing? Could they, kind of what were their options? It's like 34% of older adults who don't have a spouse, maybe their spouse have passed, or they don't have a significant other or a child who is there to be able to care for them. So, that's a big group of people. Historically, we always kind of relied on our children, right? But that's not the case for so many people. So how do you help seniors who are kind of facing this issue of aging alone?
So you really brought up a good point. Those who may have lost, their spouses or, lost their children. And so on top of, the lack of companionship and the eyes on them, they're also dealing with grief, which could definitely, overwhelm that situation. And so I would say that the biggest part of the plan is bringing in the companionship, because isolation, as we know, can affect their health. And so the other thing I would say is that, just planning for those things, planning for the emergencies, considering, how do I bring that world that may not exist? And so you mentioned about, community housing, maybe looking at assisted livings, just to have an extra set of eyes on them so that way they don't feel so alone.
No, I really agree. I think that planning is a huge part of it, and that's part of what we do. So one of the things that I wanted to announce is that you're working with us now to be able to support seniors, to be able to kind of marry that legal planning with all of the care planning and to sort of deal with all of those contingencies, because I think clients come to me and they won't have done their estate planning because of really simple things. They're like, well, first of all, I don't know who to name as my power of attorney or as my healthcare proxy, but then they're worried about little things like, what's going to happen if I am hospitalized, and who's going to know to take care of my cat? Things like that are major issues.
The other thing I want to bring up is like safety, right? And so part of the planning, in addition to companionship, is ensuring that they're safe. And then, like you said, not only the cat that needs to be taken care of, but who's going to ensure that if I'm not able to have that voice and have to go to the emergency room and then a hospitalization, who's going to be there to advocate for me to ensure that my wishes, are respected, my value system. And so that's another area that I'll find that people may call you in the middle of the night because they want that support in those type of environments.
Yeah. I know that a lot of people, they kind of laugh at the idea of the bracelet, I've fallen and I can't get up. And, people feel like, oh, that's not stylish. That's only for old people. But there are other solutions to address, which is a real issue in terms of what happens if we have a medical emergency and there's no one in our home who knows about it.
Yeah. And I really like the fact that, not just the cat, but like the flowers, the plants in the home, ensuring that the mail is taken in, because we know that mail that is standing around and piling up can present some unwanted visitors into the home. And so you're absolutely right. There's, in addition to the companionship, and the safety, we also have those practical things that need to be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. I was court-appointed counsel for a woman recently whose husband had passed, and then she ended up being hospitalized. It ended up being a more long-term hospitalization, and that's exactly what happened. Her mail started building up, and then the police got called because there were people who were basically casing her house. So that's actually how the guardianship action got brought, was because the police reached out to Adult Protective Services. So.
Well, one of the things I say, even those who, are married and have children, is that, those who they appoint to make those decisions for them when they're not able to, sometimes they take for granted that it's the spouse. And so the good thing about those who are solo agents, they don't have that option, right? Because sometimes that spouse can't make those decisions, even though they say they can. And in the last moment, they make their decisions. And so the good thing about solo agents, which is a plus, is that they can, research someone and really talk to the person that they determine, can make those decisions. And so I consider that a plus. The other thing I tell my clients is you have to have these conversations with your doctors over and over and over again, so they truly understand, what you want. Again, when you can't make those decisions for yourself.
No, absolutely. So you started to talk a little bit about medical decisions, but let's really focus in on end of life. How is being a solo ager different for end of life?
They have this vision in their head that they're going to be on the floor, laying for days, and no one knows that they're there. Absolutely. That is one of their biggest fears.
Yeah.
The other one is, who's going to, whether you have a person making a decision, those power of attorneys, when they take their last breath, they're no longer valid.
That's right.
So who's going to make the decisions after they take their last breath? In the state of New Jersey, we have that, I believe it's called a
funeral representative.
Yeah.
Yes.
Who can help you ensure that you have those services and that your body is taken care of in the manner that you desire. And so that's another concern. Who's going to help? Who's going to help with the estate?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, we do see that. I mean, I have seen that in my practice where there's been nobody to claim the body from the morgue because nobody has the legal authority to do so. And I've had people who call me, they want to claim the body of their friend, but they have no authority to do it. So it can be a very problematic situation.
That's really interesting because that happened with a family member. And, I just thought that no one wanted to claim the body. And maybe they really couldn't. I remember that as a young adult, that there was a body that wasn't claimed. And so that's really interesting. I appreciate that in life.
Yeah. So one of the things, you mentioned a funeral representative, one of the things that I always speak with families about is putting a funeral representative designation into their wills. We're lucky that New Jersey is a state that does provide a lot of tools for individuals who want to plan ahead. They want to plan for their future and their legacy wishes. So, of course, everybody knows about wills. They may not know that you can have a funeral representative named in it, but they know about wills. And we also have powers of attorney and healthcare proxy, which, we can talk about all of that. But there's other legal documents that can be really helpful for solo seniors that maybe, wouldn't be as common with individuals who aren't alone. So we have revocable trusts. We have healthcare instruction directives, which, as you said, that's really the place where you give the instruction to the individual. It doesn't replace the conversation. That's still very important, but you can really lay out what you want. And in revocable trusts, we'll often lay out language about what you want, whether that's aging in place, how to allocate the funds to make aging in place a possibility. So those are all things. But I think the other thing with legal documents is, they don't have to be formulaic. We don't have statutory forms in New Jersey in the sense that, not like in New York where they kind of have to be followed. So it's really useful because we can add to the documents and tailor them to the needs of the individual. So, because I don't know if you've seen this in your practice, but I find that solo agers are particularly vulnerable to financial exploitation. Is that something you've seen?
Yeah, and you know what, you brought up another really good point, and one of the things that I really appreciate about you is that you really do tailor those documents. And so when I go into homes, sometimes when they have these long, drawn out wishes, they don't even know where they are. And what I like about you is that you'll make it as formal as informal, as needed. And so I really appreciate that as well.
No,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
No, I work with clients. I've had clients who put in their instruction directives things about, they want to be taken out in the sun on a daily basis, or, they want to live at home no matter what, or who they want to be with them in their final days or who they don't want to be with them. So those are all things that can be incorporated in. But in terms of protecting against financial exploitation, we add things like perhaps a trust protector or a trust advisor if they've got a financial advisor who they really want, to make sure that they continue to stay involved.
One of the things I will say is that research shows that the financial abuser or any type of abuser is normally the next of kin. It's usually the family. And so the fact that you put those things in place for solo agers is great. I think it's also needed for, those who have a family, because the research does say you're most likely to be abused by a family member.
That is true. That is true. But many solo agers, they are working with family members, but it may be someone who maybe they don't know quite as well. So it might be, a niece or a nephew who all of a sudden gets very, involved and wants to be very helpful. And that solo ager, they have a lot of gratitude for that. But it turns out that there's maybe not the best motive associated with that. So in that situation, we can put in other things. We can put in monitors, a professional who's maybe not doing all of it, but isn't monitoring on an annual basis. If they have a couple of different people, so they want to kind of have, make some balance and make sure that one can kind of watch the other, then maybe we have some kind of tiebreaker, because if they disagree, then what happens? So there's a lot of customization that we can do with those documents.
And the reality is that those questions are not always asked. And just to go back to the environment they want, one of the questions I ask my client is, do you want to be taken out during the day, your body? Some will say, you know what, I don't want Susan to see me being taken out by the funeral director. And so they'll say, you know what, I want to be taken out at night. And as you know, there's no time limit. As long as the funeral director is directing that body, there's no time limit on when you need to call that funeral. And so sometimes they'll say, no, I don't. And then other clients may say, you know what, I'm so closely tied to my community that maybe they can come out and clap me out. It really is, asking those questions in addition to the legal ones.
Yeah, and I think that's really where someone like you, your role comes in, because, I like to work with my clients more broadly and focus beyond the legal documents. But, even at the end of the day, once the legal documents are done, that's really just the beginning of the planning.
Yeah.
Because all of that emergency planning, all of that contingency, safety net things that, we sort of briefly touched on, that is really best worked on with someone like yourself or a care manager, and really kind of fleshing out, okay, great, you have the legal documents done. Now, how are we going to make sure that your wishes are going to be followed through?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I create for my clients is what I call a living well plan. And so you can determine, like when you go into that active dying phase and you can't make the decisions for yourself, what do you want that environment to look like? Do you want the candles? Do you want the essential oils going? Who needs to be called? And like you said, who do you want there?
Right.
Because people will show up that you may not want in that space.
Yeah. No, that's important. So we're talking about end of life. I have to bring up, I know you and I are both really big proponents of POLST, the Practitioner Order on Life-Sustaining Treatment. We're very lucky in New Jersey that we have the POLST being recognized. So that's a medical order, and I find that it's more honored than a living will because it is a medical order, and so it's more likely to have a doctor recognize it.
So if I can just interject here.
Yeah, absolutely.
As much as we have connection now in our healthcare space, where, like the communication, one doctor can, sign in and see what another doctor is saying. I don't think we're quite there as it relates to our documents. And so I tell people, make a bunch of copies, no matter where you go. But even with the post form, because a doctor may, create a post form, but if you're taken out of one environment and going to another, chances are it may follow you, but chances are it may not. And
Yeah.
so that's really important that you have those copies so that your wishes are, granted. When you go in and they ask for permission to perform, services for you, at that point you should also be able to. Because how many times do we say, do you have a living will? Yes, but there are no continued questions they ask. And so
Right. They don't necessarily have a copy of it. No, absolutely. The other thing that always amazes me is, I'll have clients who I'm working with and they have, life-limiting diagnoses, whether it's a terminal illness or just something that, is likely to progress. And no one has had a conversation with them about doing a pulse. And so I'm the one who is bringing up that, so I think that is really great advocacy. And I know that professionals like yourself do work with clients to be able to advocate with their doctors to make sure
Absolutely.
that their doctors do work with them to do something like that.
And speaking of limited time on this earth due to an illness, one of the things that we did not mention, but that I believe that we're lucky to have in the state of New Jersey is medical aid in dying. To be able to
100%.
make that choice on when and how you want to, exit this world. And so I think in New Jersey, again, that we're really lucky to have that option.
Yes, absolutely. That is important. So tell me about what are some immediate steps that people can take today?
Yeah, well, I think as a society, we need to eliminate the stigma around solo agers. Sometimes you say, I've never been married, and all of a sudden the room gets quiet. Or I chose not to have children, or I couldn't have children. We need to accept all people on how they show up in the world and the decisions that they have made. And so one of the things I would say outside of society, but the personal decisions is, I would say that, create that community, create that chosen family, which you may find is better than, anyone's, actual family, but decide who you want to be in your circle. Decide on what neighbor, may want to check on you when the snow comes. The other thing I would think in terms of, creating those documents, I think that that's really important, assigning informal roles as well as formal roles.
Sure. Because chosen family is wonderful, but they have to actually have legal authority to step in. And so you want to make sure that you can do that.
And I think that's where you come in,
Yeah.
I look at this social, emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being, and all need to be continued to on what are the legal rights.
Yeah. No, and I think the other thing is, okay, we talked about getting the legal documents, but, there's also things that people need to sort of start to plan out in terms of how are they going to receive care. So, something like 70% chance that an individual who's over 65 is going to need long-term care. Yeah. And so what is that going to look like, and understanding what those options are. And okay, if aging in place is really important to me, then what are the very, very practical things that I need to put in place to make sure that that can happen?
And one of the things may be like financially. When you have a spouse, you may have a second income. When you have children, they may step in and help you pay for those costs. And so I think that is also really important that you look at a plan and you look at the resources that are out there to be able to make those, your wishes, especially as, the living arrangements, right? We know the cost of assisted livings.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the studies show that individuals who haven't taken the time to make a specific care plan, they're much more likely to end up aging or passing in an institution. So if it's important to you, you have to plan for it, right?
What are your thoughts on long-term care insurance? Is that something that you...
I do really, I support it. It's not feasible for everyone, and it may not be appropriate for everyone depending on where they are financially. But I think for many, many people, it is really the difference between them being able to be at home and not.
Yeah.
Because the cost of being at home can be higher than institutional care in some situations, particularly here in New Jersey where we have high property taxes, maintaining that household. All of those things can be expensive, and then you add the care component, and especially if you can't be alone at night. So, but long-term care coverage can make that difference. So it really is so important.
Yeah. And I think that, like you said, again, going back to those extra set of eyes, if there's a decline and no one's there to recognize it,
Right.
and it puts you in a person that, for example, like maybe a cognitive decline or a physical decline, it's great to have that support system in place as it relates to people having a set of eyes on you.
And it's so interesting because so much focus on aging in place and everybody wants to be at home. But that, at the same time, all the studies talk about how loneliness and isolation is, really impacts, your health. And so the question is aging in place the best scenario for many people? And maybe we have to sort of change that mindset of aging in place could be in a senior independent living or a continuing care retirement community, because that is your home now. And yes, maybe you don't want to go to the nursing home side of it, but it doesn't have to mean living in a single family house by yourself. And that's where co-housing or an apartment building that's sort of a naturally occurring retirement community where all the neighbors, are
activities,
watching.
right?
And activities, which you'll find a lot of times in senior buildings. So that kind of thing, I think people really have to reframe their thoughts on what, aging in place means.
And I also think that there is like a sweet spot, though, when you do decide, and you have to intuitively know your clients, that sweet spot when it's time to make that decision. Mm-hmm. Sometimes when you go past that, then you're dealing with a response to an emergency. The other thing that I really stress with my clients is it's one thing to have a person in the home. You want to have someone who's cognitively engaging you, who's providing that socialization, and not just a body. So one of the things I tell people is that you can find me, in a 4-star restaurant, or you can find me sitting in the car telling jokes, eating White Castles with a client. Just that cognitive engagement and knowing what it is that they need. And so one of the things I do as part of my Living Well plan is to ask, who are you? Who are you now? And who would you like to be with the proper support?
Right. No, that's great. Yeah. And I think that's what we've sort of designed as our approach in terms of dealing with providing that life care plan for people, that we get to know, you can take the time to really get to know the individual, what their goals are, and then we can help support them. How do they get to those goals? Whether it's passing on assets to loved ones or whether it's really using those assets in a way that's going to support whatever lifestyle they want. But they need that support to get there.
Yeah. And we didn't really talk about the legacy, right? Like some people choose to donate their financial resources when they take that last breath to like a cause that they really, really, really believe in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And while we're talking about legacy, I think that a will for individuals who are solos is even more important, because there is so much planning that needs to go on to that. We do have inheritance tax in New Jersey. So if you don't have direct bloodline beneficiaries, there is going to be a tax associated with those funds. So there are ways that we can address that ahead of time and, make sure that your estate after you're gone is dealt with the way you want it as well, whether it's charities, whether it's, more remote family, or, whatever the individual's wishes are. That's a part of it too, of your plan. And you really need to make sure that it's, taken care of as well.
And I would have to say that's why I enjoy sitting at your feet, learning these the things you can do within the law and what you should not be doing. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Everything that you bring to the table.
Thank you. I appreciate that too. So one little anecdote about that. I had a family come to me and the uncle had passed away, and he did not have a lot of assets. And so he kind of took the old-fashioned approach to this, which was, he added his nephews that he had a good relationship with. He added them to his accounts and had joint accounts. But he didn't do a will. And that ended up being a huge problem, even though the only assets that were going to pass under a will were like a car and, just a small amount of assets, most things were going to go to the beneficiaries on the joint account. It still costs thousands of dollars to deal with because not having a will means that all of the other next of kin have to be notified, even if you haven't seen them for 20 years. So it can be almost more important for solo seniors to do that estate planning, even if they have really modest estates. So,
I mean, paying $1,000, you may have to decide, do I want that car,
Yeah, exactly. But, just wrapping things up can be more complicated. And that's, again, why that planning is all the most important. Well, I thank you for this conversation, and I look forward to working with you to help more people plan and kind of get to that place. Tell me again what you said about where they are now, where they want to be in the future.
So definitely I would create that support system. I would definitely talk to my doctor so that they're intimately involved and really understand what you desire. And as a society, I would say that we need to get rid of that stigma. And we also, one of the things I do that I didn't really mention is that, do as much of that funeral planning as you feel comfortable, right? You can write your eulogy. You can pick the songs. You can choose what you want to have done to your body. Do you want to be cremated? Do you want to donate it? That's one of the conversations that we need to have as well.
Yeah, or not, if that's not something you're comfortable with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the point I was making.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Appreciate that. This has been Norris McLaughlin's Aging Answers, a limited podcast series discussing the key topics revolving around elder law planning and long-term care. I want to thank my guest, Adrian Allotey, and you, the listener, for being a part of this conversation. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. If you'd like to learn more about our work, please email me at aginganswers@norris-law.com.